Good morning, everyone. So I hope we all had a nice weekend. So today what we'll be doing, we're going to start with our Jeopardy quiz for the drugs lecture. So let's see, do we have Juan? Where is Juan? Don't see Juan yet. We need Christopher. There's Christopher. Jacob, where's Jacob? We don't see Jacob. Oh, there's Jacob. He is connecting to audio right now. And there is Ashley. So the only person that we are missing is Juan. While we're waiting to see if he logs on, let me just kind of give an overview of this week and next week. So this week we are talking about sex offenders. Sorry, we have to start talking about sex offenders at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, but I don't make the schedule. Maybe one of these days they will not schedule me first thing in the morning. But in 5 years of teaching here, that has not happened. So we're going to talk about sex offenders this week. Next week, we are doing no Zoom lectures, one-on-one policy brief workshop. So be sure to go ahead and schedule an appointment with me. If you would like to go ahead and have your meeting this week, that works as well. What I can't do right away is guarantee you 2 meetings immediately. I need to make sure that everybody has time to schedule a meeting with me. So I can't guarantee you a meeting this week and next week. We have to just kind of wait and see if there's some room left over. But I want to give everybody time to schedule a meeting with me. So if you haven't done that already, consider trying to get your meeting in with me this week. And if not, we will try to schedule you next week when that works for your schedule. A few of you have already scheduled meetings with me, so thank you for that. Let's see, what else? Any questions before we get started?
I'm sorry, Dr. Hill, did you say that I'm supposed to be playing Jeopardy today? Because I didn't get that last week.
Yes, it does look like that. Did you already take?
Yeah, I took my quiz. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you say that when you gave the names out. I didn't think I was on the list for today.
Huh. All right. Well, don't worry about it. We'll see if we can squeeze you in next week. It's going to be a lot of you next week, but we'll make it work. So we have Christopher and Jacob. Where is Juan? Does anybody know where Juan is? Do we have him today?
I can run down to his room real quick.
Who just said that? Where's that? Who's that?
John.
How long is that going to take you, John? Can you just call him?
I don't have his number, but he lives like 30 seconds away.
All right, I'm giving you 30 seconds. Run. Okay. So, any questions while we are hoping John runs really fast? No questions? Okay. Again, sorry to talk about sex offenders so early in the morning. This lecture, I think, is one of the more interesting ones because most people are horribly misinformed about sex offenders, their behavior, their recidivism rate, all kinds of things about them. So basically, all we're doing today is dispelling myths about sex offenders. And then on Wednesday, what we'll start doing is talking about the treatments that are available for them. And then on Friday, what we'll be doing is talking about some of the more restrictive policies that have been put in place for sex offenders, like registration, residence restrictions, meaning like you can't live near a school or a park, or a bus stop or anything like that. Civil commitment, which is probably one of the more controversial ones, and we're actually going to watch a video about that. Where is he, John?
He's hopping on right now.
Oh, for crying! What was he doing? Was he sleeping?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Well, good thing he's got a speedy friend like you. I'm going to give him shit the second he logs on. Okay, so like I was saying, we're going to watch a really interesting video. It's a documentary done by PBS about civil commitment. Civil commitment basically means that once you, depending on the state that you're in, if the state deems that you are a sexually violent predator, and their definition varies by state, but it's always very vague. If the state deems that you are a sexually violent predator, then once you are done serving your term of incarceration, they move you to another incarcerated setting where they claim you're just receiving treatment, but basically it's another prison, and you are put there indefinitely. That they can hold you until they consider you to be cured. But unfortunately, rarely is someone released from that. So civil commitment has been fighting its way through the court system for over a decade. As you might imagine, it seems horribly unconstitutional. This person has been served their term of incarceration, and we are still holding them in an incarcerated setting, and there's no appeals process. That if they basically find you a sexually violent predator, that's that. You can't appeal it. You can't, go to trial for it. That's the end of it. So stay tuned. Some states, I think the documentary that we watch is based in Michigan or Wisconsin, something like that. But when the documentary was published, the sex offenders had created a class action lawsuit, and the state Supreme Court had basically forced the state to look at their policies again. But I think that's making its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court at this point. So I'm expecting the laws on this to change at any moment. Different states, they're moving their way through their state Supreme Courts. But it really just depends on if the U.S. Supreme Court wants to take their case. And as far as I know, they have not done so yet. All right. I still don't see Juan. I don't know where he is. So we're just going to have to get started. All right. Let's see. Let me pull up the lecture. Okay. All right, so Jacob and Christopher, if you guys want to pop your mics on, let's get started. Here we go.
That's true.
Yes, very good. That was Christopher, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right.
Therapeutic treatment.
Yes, I think you mean therapeutic communities, but we will go
yes,
with that. Yes, very good. Okay.
False.
Ooh, Christopher, you want to take that one?
That's true.
There we go. All right, here we go.
Is it drug courts?
Oh, nope. Little hint, you already said it.
The therapy one?
Therapeutic communities?
Therapeutic, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, oh, I'm sure that's what you meant. Very good. Yes, nice job, Jacob. All right, and last one.
I recommend implementing therapeutic communities to reduce recidivism.
There you go. Yes. All right, Chris is our winner. Both of you will be getting 5 points for playing. Looks like Juan has just entered the waiting room. Sorry, buddy. All right, so any questions before we start talking about sex offenders? No questions? All right, well, let's get started. So basically, like I said today, all we're going to be doing is dispelling myths about sex offenders. So the first one that we want to talk about is that a lot of people seem to think that sex offenders make up a huge portion of our correctional population, and that's not really the case. So we have about 6.8 million people under correctional supervision right now. That includes people that are incarcerated, on probation, on parole, house arrest, electronic monitoring, any sort of correctional supervision is what I mean. We've got about 6.8 million under correctional supervision in the US, and less than 5% were convicted of a sex offense. So sex offenders make up a very small portion of our offenders under correctional supervision. The next thing that people often confuse is that most of them are in prison, and a little under half. So about 60% of them are in the community serving their term or serving some sort of supervision term in the community. About 40% of them are actually incarcerated. So even when we look at all the people that are under correctional supervision in the community, sex offenders still make up a really small portion of them. So they only make up about 4.7% of people under all correctional supervision. When we're looking at people that are on probation, only 3% of them are sex offenders, and only about 7% of parolees are sex offenders. So they still make up a really small proportion of the people that are serving their term in the community. So that's sort of the first myth that I often hear from students, is that they think this population of sex offenders is huge. And that's not really the case. So the other common myth I hear is that violent offenders are much more common than property offenders, and it's always the other way around. Property offenders are much, much more common. Violent offenders are less common. And then even within violent offenders, sex offenders make up a really small proportion of those offenders. So it's not the sort of widespread issue that the media makes it seem like it is. I mean, these crimes are sensational, they're horrible. And because of social media and the access that everybody has to media sources, crimes that are far away seem very close at home. And just because of the way the news is spread nowadays, the way that we can easily access it, a lot of crimes seem a lot more sensationalized and a lot more common than they actually are. So that's sort of the first myth I want to talk about. Sex offenders are not nearly as common as most people think they are. Like I said, less than 5% of all people under correctional supervision, 3% of probationers, 7% of parolees. So the next myth is that they have really high recidivism rates. That is not the case. So, for instance, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, about 30% of sex offenders are rearrested for any crime within 1 year. The national average is about 44%. So sex offenders, when we're looking at just 1 year for any crime, only 30.9% of them are rearrested. Now, when you're looking for rearrested for a sex crime, only 12% of them are rearrested for a sex crime within 3 years. So that's a really small percentage of them. The national average, when we're looking at committing the same crime again, whether it's a property offense or a murder, burglary, larceny, whatever, when you're looking at committing the same offense again within 3 years, the national average is about 34%. So again, we're seeing sex offenders below the national average. So this last bullet on here that's kind of oddly phrased, and I can't figure out how to say this in a less confusing way. If we are putting in order the number of, if we are listing the number of people that are least likely to commit another crime, the least likely to recidivate, those that are least likely to recidivate are those that are convicted of manslaughter or murder. The next on that list are sex offenders. So people convicted of manslaughter or murder are the least likely to commit another crime. Sex offenders are the ones directly below that. So they are the second population least likely to commit another crime. So if you see what this says here, sex offenders are the least likely population to recidivate after those convicted of murder, manslaughter. Again, it's the property offenders that are doing all the recidivating. So sometimes a question I get is this statistic skewed because those convicted of murder, manslaughter aren't being released from prison? That's not how we measure recidivism. It's always a release cohort. So it's people that have been released from prison. We're looking at the crime that they went to prison for, and are they committing another crime? So this number isn't low because people convicted of murder, manslaughter are more likely to still be incarcerated. When you do recidivism rates, you're looking at a cohort of people that have already been released from prison. So to dispel some of the most common misconceptions, sex offenders are a relatively small percentage of the total correctional population, and they are very unlikely to recidivate, especially for another sex crime. Now, where you may see some skewing of these statistics, we know that sex crimes are the crimes that are least likely to be reported to the police. So it's possible that this arrest data is underestimating the true victimization rates and are distorting the nature of sex offending. Some researchers show that only about half of all sex crimes are actually reported to the police. So it's possible these numbers are, underestimated due to the fact that sex crimes are the least likely offense to be reported to the police. So there are also plenty of studies that show that sex offenders have many more victims than they've been arrested for. But of the available research that we have for the last 3 decades, the majority of convicted sex offenders do not repeat their crimes. So we can say, it's possible that these numbers are wrong, but based on 30 years of research, this is what we have. And we can't, we can say, you might want to take this with a grain of salt, but we can't say these numbers are definitely wrong. The best that we can say is that it's likely they're a little bit higher than what we have. All right, let's talk about more myths. So when most people say sex offender, usually there's this sort of pervasive cultural stereotype, and we think of the same type of person. So when I say sex offender, I'd be willing to guarantee that 100% of you guys are thinking of some scary dude with like a mustache, perhaps like this, that wears rapist glasses, that drives a white panel van and drives around schools looking to pick up kids. Am I incorrect? Is that what most of you guys are thinking? That's what I'm assuming. That's what most of the US thinks when you say sex offender. However, that is far from the norm. So we have this sort of pervasive cultural stereotype about sex offenders that they specialize in sexual predation, especially towards kids. So that's what most people sort of jump to when you think of a sex offender. So when I'm saying they specialize, I mean they're only committing sex crimes, and usually just within one population, like kids or females, of a certain age, or of, a certain, have a certain look, right? That's what most people think when you think of a sex offender. And what I say is when they specialize, that's what I mean, right? So that sort of logic and that cultural stereotype has provided the rationale for the adoption of increasingly restrictive policies designed to monitor, deter, and punish sex offenders in the US. So things like sex offender registration, residency restrictions. Like I said, you can't live near a school or a bus stop or a park. Community notification, sticking a sign in your front yard that says I'm a sex offender, or going around to your neighbors and knocking on the door and telling them, hey, I've been convicted of a sex crime. Polygraph testing. So sex offenders are almost always the only ones when they go in to meet with their parole or their probation officer that are given a polygraph test. Or GPS monitoring. Other people are given electronic monitoring, but sex offenders exclusively are given this when they are in some sort of community notification, just as a part of their probation or parole, because they are a sex offender. And lastly, the civil commitment that I was talking about at the beginning of class. So all of those policies were designed because that's what most people think of when they think of a sex offender. So while some sex offenders may fit that stereotype of this sort of sex predator specialist, that is far from the norm. Studies consistently find that although certain sex offenders do display a certain amount of specialization, meaning they commit just sex crimes or the majority of the crimes they commit are sex crimes, this is overestimated, and criminal versatility is much more common. Those who commit sex crimes also commit property crimes, other violent crimes, drug crimes, or any other sort of, sometimes they're involved in fraud, any other type of crime. So basically what we see here, most people that are convicted of a sex crime are more likely to have committed a litany of other crimes. It's a very small percentage of them that specialize in just sex crimes. So let me give you an example study. So there was a recent study done in Colorado, and it was a representative sample of Colorado sex offenders released on parole. And basically they just took this cohort, this release cohort of all sex offenders released on parole in Colorado for, 5 or 6 years, probably whatever data they could get their hands on. And they were just sort of giving frequencies of what is the average sex offender on parole in Colorado look like. So only 20% of the sample could be described as specialists, meaning over half of their arrests involved sex offenses, or they had more than one sex arrest on their record. But only 4.2% of the entire sample had been arrested exclusively for sex crimes. So that is usually, that 4.2%, we see that number less than 5% across the nation. So it's not just Colorado. So that sort of cultural stereotype that most of you guys think of when we think of a sex offender, that represents usually less than 5% of all sex offenders in the US. So going back to that Colorado study, the criminal versatility of the sample of these sex offenders released on parole in Colorado suggests that very few of them can accurately be described as a sexual specialist. Most of the sex offenders released on parole in Colorado generally appeared to be offenders first and second, sex offenders second, that most of them engaged in all other types of crimes. So this study, nor am I trying to say that these people don't commit horrible crimes or present no danger to public safety. That's not what I'm trying to say, and that's not what this study in Colorado is trying to say. All I'm trying to say, and all this study is trying to say, is that there is a gap between this stereotypical image of a sex offender that those policies promote and are justified by, and the real characteristics of sex offenders that the policies are actually applied to. So if we are using these restrictive policies because we are terrified that sex offenders all specialize and they all have high recidivism rates, that makes sense. But that represents about 4% of all sex offenders. And unfortunately, these policies are applied to you regardless of if you are that 4% or if you are in the 96% that is just, an asshole first and a sex offender second, right? So, like we saw on the last slide, sex offenders always make up a small percentage of the prison population, and the typical offender is male, 99% male, 66% white, about 60% of them have a previous felony conviction, and here we're getting into the specialization again. Only 10 to 15% of them had a previous sexual offense conviction. If we're looking at only sex offense convictions, the number gets even smaller. So depending on how you categorize sex offender specialization, it's always a small percentage of sex offenders. So the typical sex offender serving time in prison, only 10 to 15% of them had one previous sex offense conviction. That number gets even lower, usually less than 5% if we're looking at people that only commit sex crimes. So let's talk about the average sentence. Now, this is the average. Keep in mind, every state is a little bit different. So every state has different numbers, and every state has different sort of confidence intervals, like fluctuations plus or minus, depending on your previous offenses. But on average, across our nation, people convicted of rape usually are convicted to about 12 and a half years in prison. Sexual assault looks like about 8.5 years. Now, the number of time that you actually serve for that versus are released on some sort of community supervision or parole has been increasing due to the sentencing changes. So, like I said, when we switched to the justice model, and you saw that like 85%, you got to serve at least 85% of your sentence. That's why we're seeing them spending actually more time in prison than they had before. So even if that first number, 12 and a half, didn't change between the rehabilitative ideal and the justice model, the amount of time they have to serve while they're like in prison has been increasing due to those sentencing changes. So again, this is just the average. Some states are more punitive than others, and it really depends on what your previous record looks like as well. A lot of states have presumptive sentencing guidelines, which looks like a very complicated matrix. If you took my intro class, you may recall me talking about this, where it'll have like the categories of crimes across the top and your criminal history along the side, and you kind of sort of meet in the middle, and it'll tell you how much time you have to serve. So just again, these are average numbers. All right, questions about this before we continue with this super happy topic? All right, let's make it even worse. Let's talk about juvenile sex offenders. So here's another myth we're going to talk about. So if you're looking at juvenile sex abuse victims, half of them were abused by another juvenile. So what we're seeing here is that half of all juvenile sex abuse victims were abused by another juvenile. So we're seeing juvenile on juvenile sex abuse happening here in about half of those cases. So, like I said, roughly half of youths who are sexually abused are abused by another youth. So let's talk about those youths right there, the ones that are juvenile sex offenders. So much like their adult counterparts, the recidivism rate of juvenile sex offenders is fairly low. So only about 7% of them will recidivate for another sex crime. So not only is their recidivism rate low, we're also seeing that sort of same trend in a lack of sex offender specialization among juveniles as well. So just like their adult counterparts, juvenile sex offenders are usually just offenders first and sex offenders second. So, like adults, juveniles' rate of non-sexual recidivism is much higher, about 6 times higher than that of sex offender recidivism. So if you're a juvenile that has committed a sex crime, chances are it's about 6 times more likely that if you commit another crime, it's not going to be a sex crime. It's going to be some other type of crime. So that sort of specialization that we saw in adults or lack thereof, we're seeing it with the juveniles too. So sex offender specialization, regardless of if you're adult or a juvenile, is very, very rare. All right, so let's talk about recidivism in general. So when comparing juvenile and adult sex offender recidivism rates, a recent meta-analysis found that youth had slightly higher recidivism rates. So again, juvenile sex offenders have low recidivism rates, but when you're comparing them to adult sex offenders, they're slightly higher. So the author made 2 big arguments about why that might be the case. So the author here, this Caldwell study, showed that juveniles alter their sex offender behavior in response to developmental maturity. So what he's saying here is it appears that developmental forces are playing a significant role in adolescent antisocial decision-making in general, but sexual behavior specifically. And if you think about this, this is pretty consistent with the age crime curve, right? So most of them will kind of grow out of it once they surpass those awkward adolescent years. So the author is making the argument that these developmental forces are what is causing this abnormal sexual behavior. And about the time that it's these developmental forces that are playing a role in this sort of behavior. And once their hormones and their brain hormones sort of settle down and their brain becomes fully developed around the age of 25, the vast majority of them will grow out of it. And that explains why juveniles have a slightly higher recidivism rate than adults in terms of sex offenses and just in general too. If you're just looking at juvenile delinquents versus adult criminals, you always see higher recidivism rates for juveniles. And if any of you are looking at juvenile, any sort of intervention for juveniles for your policy brief, you're going to find that a lot of these programs really have a null effect, like they're making no difference whatsoever, or they might seem to be making the juveniles worse. And we almost never see that with adults. And it has a lot to do with the age crime curve and these developmental forces that are playing a role. So the results found in this meta-analysis lend support to the view that developmental issues are playing a dominant role in adolescent sexual misconduct, that sexual behavior is relatively stable within a developmental phase, but changes with the transition to a new developmental stage, like young adulthood. So they stay pretty stable, and then once they sort of age out of crime, that's when we start to see sort of a decline in that behavior. So where this becomes an issue is that oftentimes many sex offender registration laws either include or they target juveniles. And the problem here is that once you are on a sex offender registration list, you are there for life. So it doesn't make sense if the vast majority of them are going to grow out of this behavior for us to continuously be watching them for the rest of their lives. And it gets even worse if you're in a state that has civil commitment that allows someone that is convicted of a sex crime as a juvenile to be civilly committed after they have served their sentence. That's even more restrictive than sex offender registration. And the documentary that we're going to watch on Friday profiles a kid that was arrested at the age of 15 and is now civilly committed, and he's like almost 40. So this kid is well beyond the age crime curve. So we have at least 33 states that require juveniles to be included in sex offender registries if they are convicted of a sex offense. So it really depends on the state. It depends on the offender. But some registration laws do allow for exceptions for juveniles involved with sex with a similarly aged consenting peer. So like a statutory rape case. So some states allow you to be excluded from either civil commitment or sex offender registries if it was that particular charge. But registration laws specifically are typically applied to just categories of offenders without an individual assessment of risk for future sex offenses. So what I mean by that is if you're convicted of a sex crime, you automatically are on this registration list, and there's nobody going through to say, hey, you are unlikely to commit this crime again. We probably don't need to be watching you for life. So these laws that target juvenile sex offenders are based on the assumption that these kids differ in important and lasting ways from other delinquents in general, right? So there's no such thing as a law for other juvenile delinquents committed of another or convicted of another crime that's not a sex crime that's either going to civilly commit them or put them on a registration list. It is only sex offenders. And they're based on the assumption that juvenile sex offenders differ in important and lasting ways than other juvenile delinquents. Again, kind of back to this idea that there's specialization among sex offenders, which we know is very, very rare. So researchers really don't like these laws because these guys have such a low recidivism rate that even if we're trying to figure out what is different between those that will grow out of this versus those that become the sort of scary specialists, the percentage of those that become the scary specialist is so low. Even the percentage of the ones that commit another crime is so low that it's statistically difficult to pinpoint what is different between the two because the sample size is so low. So we can't really tell the difference between what is different between somebody going through an awkward phase versus those that are going to become legitimate sexual predators. So these problem here, there's a lot of problems, but one of the problems here is that these laws are really popular with the public. And there's debate amongst researchers, though, about whether these policies are actually effective at reducing sex offender sexual recidivism. The other issue that we see, if you look at the population of adult sex offenders, almost none of them have a record as a juvenile sex offender. So if you're trying to make the case that these laws should be applied to juvenile sex offenders because they turn into adult sex offenders, you would think that the majority of adult sex offenders have a record as a juvenile sex offender, and that is almost never the case. So this raises the question as to whether juvenile sex offenders, pose a risk of adult sexual recidivism that is significantly different from other serious delinquent offenders. So as a result, the potential for sex offender registration and notification laws to reduce sexual violence among adolescents appears to be quite limited. Again, I'm not saying these kids shouldn't be punished. I'm not saying these kids shouldn't go to treatment. All I'm saying is that we probably don't need to put them on a sex offender registration list for the rest of their life or civilly commit them for the rest of their life. So what researchers think would be more effective than just blindly placing all juvenile sex offenders on a registration list would be a short-term intervention that brings adolescent sex offender behavior under control. We already know that juvenile sex offenders have a higher recidivism rate during adolescence compared to adulthood. So that suggests that interventions that target juvenile sex offenders during these teen years, when we know that they have a higher likelihood of committing another crime, is going to have a greater impact when they're at this high risk time period, right? So we need to be focusing and treating them and working with them while they are in that time period where they are likely to commit this other crime. Once they age out of this and have received these developmentally sensitive treatments, it's highly unlikely they're going to do this again. So let's talk about some of these developmentally sensitive treatments. So treatments that focus on cognitive changes related to development, hormonal changes related to the onset of puberty. Usually there's the role of family and peers plays a huge role in sex offender behavior. Looking at treatment, looking at judgment and impulse control, those treatments can be very effective, and especially for this population. And lastly, treatment that sort of understands the response to social stressors that can cause this behavior. So a perfect example of this is being sexually abused as a child. A large number of juvenile sex offenders were sexually abused as kids themselves. So sometimes when that happens to them at a very young age, either they are manipulated by their abuser to think that that is how you show love or that is normal behavior. So I worked on the human trafficking task force, the Tri-County Human Trafficking Task Force, and I'm really good friends with a woman named Kat who runs the Formation Project. And the Formation Project provides services to human trafficking victims. And Kat was a human trafficking survivor herself, and she gives a lot of talks about this stuff, but she can remember exclusively when she was like 9 or 10, she went to a sleepover and she was asking her friends if, you know, their older cousins and uncles were having sex with them, and was completely shocked that that was not normal behavior. She thought they were all lying to her. Like, she had been so manipulated to think that that was normal behavior that even when her friends told her, like, no, that does not happen to us, she assumed they were lying. So a lot of juvenile sex offenders have been abused as children and have sort of this understanding that this is normal behavior. So those are the perfect candidates for treatment that need this specific like family treatment that understands the social stressors like child abuse that can lead to this type of behavior. And in fact, the kid that we're going to profile on Friday in the documentary, he was abused as a child and then turned into a child sex abuser himself. So that's pretty common among juvenile sex offenders, and they need that type of treatment that can help them understand that that is not normal behavior. All right, questions about this super happy stuff we talked about this morning? Nothing? No questions? All right. Well, on Wednesday, what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about the treatments that are available for sex offenders. And then we'll move into discussing sex offender registration, residency restrictions, as well as civil commitment. And like I said, we're going to watch a documentary on civil commitment. So Wednesday is one of my favorite lectures to give. If only to see the male reactions when we talk about chemical castration. So ladies, get excited about that. It is always exciting to see the looks of shock and horror from the males when we talk about that. And luckily this year, for some reason, almost every single year I've had a pre-knob in my classroom. That is the lecture that they show up to, and I horrify the shit out of them. So at least that's the silver lining of this pandemic, is I'm not going to horrify a young pre-knob with that lecture. I'm just going to horrify you guys instead. Okay? Questions? All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I will see you guys on Wednesday.
Dr. Hill,
Yes.